February 12, 1943, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The tropical sun beat down on the coral runway as 12 dark blue fighters with distinctive inverted gull wings taxied into position. Marine Fighter Squadron 124 had just arrived, and their aircraft looked like nothing the Japanese had seen before. The Vought F4U Corsair was about to enter combat for the first time, and within 2 years it would become the most feared aircraft in the Pacific, earning a nickname that would haunt Japanese pilots until the war's end: Whistling Death. This is the story of how an aircraft initially rejected by the US Navy transformed into a weapon that dominated the skies, crushed Japanese air power, and terrified an enemy who had once ruled the Pacific. It's a story the Japanese side tells with grudging respect and undeniable fear. But it didn't start that way. The Corsair's combat debut was, frankly, a disaster. On February 14, 1943, St. Valentine's Day, VMF 124 joined Army P-38s and P-40s, escorting Navy Liberator bombers on a raid against the Japanese airfield at Kahili. The Japanese scrambled their Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighters, and what followed became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The Americans lost 8 fighters and 2 bombers. Among the casualties were 2 brand new Corsairs. One of them collided with a Zero it was trying to engage. It was an inauspicious beginning for an aircraft that would eventually claim over 1,200 aerial victories. The Japanese pilots who encountered these strange new American fighters that day were initially unimpressed. The Corsair looked ungainly with its bent wings, massive engine, and long nose. It was larger and heavier than anything they'd faced. Some Japanese pilots joked that the Americans had sent them flying trucks. They had no idea they were witnessing the arrival of their nemesis. To understand why the Corsair became such a terror weapon, we need to go back to its design. In 1938, the US Navy Bureau of Aeronautics issued a specification for a new carrier-based fighter. They wanted something that could outperform anything in the sky. Vaught's chief designer Rex Beisel decided to build the smallest possible airframe around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial monster producing 2,000 horsepower. But that enormous engine created a problem. It needed a massive propeller over 13 feet in diameter to absorb all that power. If they used conventional straight wings, the landing gear would have to be absurdly long to keep the propeller tips from hitting the ground. Beisel's solution was revolutionary: the inverted gull wing. The wings angled downward from the fuselage, then bent upward at the point where the landing gear attached. This allowed shorter, stronger landing gear while giving the giant propeller adequate ground clearance. The design also reduced drag where the wing met the fuselage, improving overall performance. The prototype XF4U first flew on May 29, 1940, and immediately set a record. It became the first single-engine US fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. The Navy was thrilled and ordered 584 aircraft. But when carrier trials began in 1941, serious problems emerged. The long nose made it nearly impossible for pilots to see the carrier deck during landing approaches. The powerful engine and huge propeller created tremendous torque that could flip the aircraft during takeoff if the pilot wasn't careful. The plane had a nasty tendency to stall one wing before the other during slow-speed approaches, causing it to snap roll unexpectedly. These characteristics earned it the nickname Ensign Eliminator. Young, inexperienced pilots were getting killed in training accidents. The Navy decided the Corsair was too dangerous for carrier operations and assigned it to the Marine Corps for land-based duty. The Marines, desperate for something that could challenge the Zero at high altitude, were willing to accept the risks. They needed this aircraft. By February 1943, Marine pilots were completing their training, and the Corsairs were heading to the South Pacific. The Japanese pilots they would face were among the best in the world. These were veterans who had been fighting since the war in China, men who had attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, and ruled the skies over New Guinea and the Solomons. They flew the legendary Zero, an aircraft that could outturn virtually any Allied fighter. In early 1942, Japanese pilots had achieved kill ratios as high as 12-1. They were confident, experienced, and aggressive. They were about to discover that the rules had changed. After the disastrous debut on Valentine's Day, Marine pilots began learning how to fight in the Corsair. The key was understanding what the aircraft could and couldn't do. It couldn't turn with a Zero in a traditional dogfight. The Zero was too nimble, too light, too maneuverable at low speeds. Trying to turn with a Zero was suicide. But the Corsair had advantages the Zero couldn't match. It was faster, much faster. It could dive faster than anything in the Japanese inventory. It could climb faster, especially at high altitude where the turbo-supercharged engine maintained its power, while Japanese engines gasped for air. And it was incredibly tough. The Corsair could absorb damage that would disintegrate a Zero and keep flying. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124 was one of the first to figure out the winning formula: don't dogfight. Use speed, use altitude, use power, attack from above, make one high-speed pass, and if you don't get a kill, zoom climb back to altitude using the energy from your dive. Never get slow, never turn. The Japanese call it hit and run, Walsh told his pilots. We call it fighting smart. By May 1943, the Marines were getting the upper hand. On May 13th, Walsh became the first Corsair ace when he shot down 3 Zeros in a single mission, bringing his total to 6. His tactics worked. Dive from altitude at high speed, fire a burst from the 650 caliber machine guns, zoom climb away before the Zeros could react. The Japanese pilots, used to turning fights where their superior maneuverability gave them the advantage, found themselves helpless against these slashing attacks. But what really shocked Japanese pilots was what happened when those 650 caliber guns hit their target. Each Corsair carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, 400 rounds per gun. The guns were mounted in the wings, 3 per side, and were harmonized to converge at a point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. When all 6 guns fired together, they created a cone of destruction that was unlike anything Japanese pilots had experienced. The 50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun fired a half-inch diameter projectile at 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition was a mix of armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and ball rounds. When these rounds hit an aircraft, they didn't just punch holes, they destroyed structure, ignited fuel, and tore aircraft apart. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who would survive the war with 64 victories, later wrote about encountering Corsairs over New Guinea. We called them monsters, Sakai recalled in his memoir Samurai. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect on the Corsair. I put dozens of rounds into one and watched it fly away as if I'd been throwing pebbles. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart. I saw a Zero hit by a burst from a Corsair. It didn't just go down, it disintegrated. The wings separated, the fuselage broke in half. The pilot never had a chance. Sakai's assessment reveals the fundamental problem Japanese pilots faced. The Zero was designed for maneuverability and range, and to achieve this, its designers had sacrificed armor and structural strength. The Zero had no armor plate protecting the pilot. Its fuel tanks were unprotected and prone to explosion when hit. Its structure was lightweight aluminum that couldn't withstand heavy battle damage. A Corsair, by contrast, was built like a tank. The pilot sat behind a 3/8-inch steel armor plate. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The massive radial engine could take multiple hits and keep running. The aircraft's structure was overbuilt, with multiple redundant systems. In combat, this difference was decisive. A Zero pilot who took a single burst from a Corsair's guns was probably dead. A Corsair pilot hit by cannon fire might have a rough day, but he'd probably make it home. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots began to fear the Corsair in a way they'd never feared other American aircraft. And then there was the sound. The distinctive whistle that gave the Corsair its Japanese nickname was created by wind rushing through the engine, cooling ducts and various openings in the cowling. At high speed, especially, during a dive, the airflow created a high-pitched shriek that was audible for miles. Japanese pilots and ground troops alike learned to recognize that sound as the harbinger of death. The nickname Whistling Death appeared in Japanese radio intercepts as early as mid-1943. Some historians have questioned whether Japanese forces actually used this term, suggesting it might be American propaganda. But multiple Japanese sources, including post-war interviews with surviving pilots and soldiers, confirm that the Corsair was indeed referred to with terms that translate to whistling death, or the plane that screams death. One Japanese ground soldier, interviewed after the war, described the psychological terror of that sound. You would hear it first, that terrible whistle, getting louder and louder. Then you would see them, dark shapes diving out of the sun. By the time you saw them, it was too late. The whistle meant you had seconds to live. We learned to dive for cover the instant we heard it, but often it wasn't enough. The bombs and rockets and those guns, they killed so many of us. But the worst part was the waiting, knowing they could come at any time, and that whistle would be the last thing you heard. By the summer of 1943, Corsair units were proliferating across the Pacific. VMF 124 was joined by VMF 213, VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron led by Gregory Pappy Boyington, and others. Each squadron refined the tactics, shared lessons learned, and increased the kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. The Black Sheep Squadron story deserves special mention. Formed in August 1943 from replacement pilots who hadn't been assigned to squadrons, VMF 214 under Boyington became legendary. Over 84 days of combat operations from their base in the Russell Islands, they claimed over 200 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Boyington himself scored 22 victories in Corsairs before being shot down and captured in January 1944. Japanese pilots quickly developed a grudging respect for Boyington and his Black Sheep. Radio intercepts revealed Japanese controllers warning their pilots when Boyington's distinctive aircraft, easily identified by its markings, was in the air. The Japanese nicknamed him the Black Sheep Demon. But Boyington was just one of many Corsair aces who terrorized Japanese forces. The statistics were mounting, and they told a grim story for Japan. By the end of 1943, Corsair units had achieved a kill ratio of approximately 11-1 against Japanese aircraft. For every Corsair lost in air-to-air combat, 11 Japanese aircraft went down. This ratio would improve as the war progressed and as American pilot training continued to outpace the declining quality of Japanese pilot preparation. The reason for this dramatic shift in aerial superiority was multifaceted. First, the aircraft itself. The Corsair's combination of speed, firepower, durability, and high-altitude performance gave American pilots multiple advantages they could exploit. Second, tactics. American pilots fought as teams, using the thatch weave and other coordinated maneuvers that maximized the Corsair's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Third, training. By 1943, American pilots were receiving 400 or more hours of flight training before entering combat, including extensive gunnery practice, instrument training, and tactical instruction. Japanese pilot training, by contrast, was declining as experienced instructors were killed and fuel shortages limited training flights. But there was another factor that Japanese pilots found even more terrifying than the day fighters. In early 1943, the US Navy recognized the need for a night fighter, capable of intercepting Japanese bombers that were conducting nuisance raids after dark. These nocturnal attacks disrupted operations, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and prevented American forces from getting rest. The solution was to convert some F4U Corsairs into night fighters by installing airborne intercept radar. The resulting F4U-2 was the first single-seat radar-equipped night fighter to enter service with any nation. Only 34 F4U-2s were produced, but their impact far exceeded their numbers. The radar antenna was housed in a fairing mounted on the right wing. To compensate for the added weight, the outermost machine gun on that wing was removed, leaving the night fighter with 5 guns instead of 6. The exhaust stacks were modified with flame dampeners to reduce the bright glow that would give away the fighter's position at night. Marine Night Fighter Squadron 532, VMF N532, received the first operational F4U-2s in late 1943. Major Everett Vaughan commanded the squadron, which began operations from Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. For Japanese pilots accustomed to operating freely at night, the appearance of American night fighters was a nasty surprise. On the night of April 14, 1944, over Ngebe Island in Eniwetok Atoll, VMF N532 scored its first victories. First Lieutenant Edward Sovick and Captain Howard Bowman each shot down a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. These twin-engine aircraft had been conducting regular night raids against American positions with impunity. Not anymore. The Japanese didn't initially understand what was happening. Night fighters were supposed to be twin-engine aircraft with a crew of 2 or 3, using heavy radar sets and requiring a dedicated radar operator. The idea that a single pilot could operate radar while flying and fighting at night seemed impossible. But First Lieutenant Frank Lang, a Corsair night fighter pilot who later became a Major General, described how they did it. The radar display was mounted on the left side of the cockpit, Lang recalled in post-war interviews. It showed blips for targets within range. You'd get a vector from ground controllers to the general area, then use your radar to close in. Once you had visual contact, which usually meant seeing the enemy's exhaust flames, you'd maneuver into position and fire. The toughest part was managing everything simultaneously. Flying instruments at night, watching the radar, searching for visual contact, all while staying aware of your altitude and position. It was intense, but the Corsair was stable enough to handle it. And our night vision was excellent because of the upward visibility from that bubble canopy. Japanese bomber crews who encountered Corsair night fighters described the experience as terrifying. The Americans seemed to appear out of nowhere in the darkness. There was no warning, no time to evade. One moment you were flying through the night, the next moment tracers were ripping through your aircraft. Some Japanese aircrews reported seeing a ghost plane, a dark shape that materialized from the blackness, fired and disappeared. They didn't understand it was radar-guided interception. The psychological impact of the night fighters extended beyond actual combat encounters. Japanese commanders, recognizing the threat, began restricting night operations in areas where Corsair night fighters were known to operate. This disruption of Japanese nocturnal bombing and supply missions was exactly what American commanders had hoped to achieve. As Major General Lang noted years later, "I know we deterred them from operating effectively at night, because as soon as we left, they came out in swarms. The presence of just 18 F4U-2s in VMF N532 was enough to suppress Japanese night air operations across a wide area of the Central Pacific. The impact was strategic, not just tactical. But it wasn't just the aircraft or the tactics or the training that made the Corsair so devastating. It was also the industrial capacity behind it. By 1944, multiple factories were producing Corsairs. Vaught's original plant was supplemented by production lines at Goodyear, which produced the FG-1 variant, and Brewster, which built the F3A-1. At peak production, new Corsairs were rolling off assembly lines at a rate of one every few hours. This industrial might meant that losses could be rapidly replaced, a luxury the Japanese did not have. Japanese aircraft production was constrained by resource shortages, factory capacity, and increasingly by Allied bombing. When a Japanese pilot was killed, replacing him took months of training time that Japan could no longer afford. When a Zero was destroyed, building a replacement was a struggle. Meanwhile, America was producing Corsairs by the thousands and training replacement pilots by the hundreds. In 1944, the Corsair underwent a significant upgrade. The F4U-1D variant introduced a more powerful version of the RT-800 engine with water injection, increasing output by 250 horsepower. More importantly, for ground attack missions, the new variant could carry external ordnance. 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb under the centerline, plus 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets on zero-length launch stubs. This transformed the Corsair from pure fighter into a formidable fighter. Bomber. Japanese ground forces in the Pacific Islands soon learned to fear the Corsair as much as pilots did. The combination of bombs, rockets, and strafing runs with those 6 heavy machine guns made the Corsair a devastating ground attack platform. One Japanese officer, captured after the war, described his unit's experience during the Battle of Peleliu. The Corsairs came every day, sometimes multiple times per day. They would dive on our positions and you could hear that terrible whistle. Then the bombs would hit, the rockets would streak in, and finally those guns would tear apart anything still standing. We lost more men to Corsair attacks than to the Marine infantry assaults. We called them the Blue Demons because of their dark blue paint and the death they brought. The Navy finally cleared the Corsair for carrier operations in April 1944. British Royal Navy pilots had already proven the aircraft could operate from carriers by developing new landing techniques, and the improved F4U-1A variant with better cockpit visibility and modified landing characteristics made carrier operations more feasible. By late 1944, in response to the kamikaze threat, Marine Corsair squadrons were assigned to Navy fast carriers to augment defensive fighter strength. But most Corsairs in 1944 and 1945 operated from land bases, supporting the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. At Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller islands, Corsairs provided close air support, flying multiple sorties per day. They attacked Japanese bunkers, gun positions, supply dumps, and troop concentrations. The Marines on the ground during the Battle of Okinawa nicknamed them the Angels of Okinawa for the critical support they provided. The Japanese experience at Okinawa illustrated how completely the Corsair dominated by early 1945. Japanese air attacks were increasingly desperate kamikaze missions, suicide attacks using aircraft as guided missiles. The Japanese had abandoned hope of air-to-air superiority. The Corsair had made conventional air combat unsustainable. But even kamikaze attacks struggled against Corsairs. The big American fighters were faster than most Japanese aircraft, could intercept suicide planes before they reached the fleet, and had the firepower to destroy incoming kamikazes before they could crash into ships. Combat air patrols of Corsairs over the invasion fleet at Okinawa shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft. Japanese pilots attempting kamikaze attacks found that reaching their targets meant first surviving layers of Corsair patrols stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. It was a gauntlet many did not survive. One Japanese kamikaze pilot, who survived his mission after his aircraft was too damaged to reach the target and he was forced to bail out, described the experience to his interrogators. The American Corsairs were everywhere. We tried to fly low to avoid them, but they dove on us from above. We tried to fly in clouds, but they found us anyway. Their guns were like walls of fire. I saw 8 of my comrades shot down in minutes. My engine was hit, my wing was on fire. I knew I would die, but I couldn't even reach the target to die with honour. As the war entered its final months in 1945, the Corsair continued its reign of terror. The F4U variant, which entered service in late 1944, featured an even more powerful engine producing 2,450 horsepower with water injection, a 4-bladed propeller for improved performance, and refined aerodynamics that increased top speed to over 440 miles per hour. This ultimate Corsair of World War II was faster than almost any Japanese aircraft could achieve, even in a dive. Japanese air defences by mid-1945 were in tatters. Experienced pilots were gone, killed in combat or expended in kamikaze attacks. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft production was declining. Training was minimal, with some pilots entering combat with less than 100 hours of total flight time. Against them flew American pilots with 400-plus hours of training, flying Corsairs with overwhelming performance advantages, supported by unlimited fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The final combat mission of World War II involving Corsairs occurred on August 15, 1945, hours after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Some Japanese pilots, either not having received the surrender order or refusing to accept it, launched attacks on American reconnaissance aircraft. Corsairs were scrambled to intercept, and in the war's final air combat, several Japanese aircraft were shot down. It was a fitting end to the Corsair's Pacific campaign, dominant until the very last moment. When the war ended, the statistics told the story of the Corsair's devastating effectiveness. Over 12,500 Corsairs had been produced. They flew 64,051 combat sorties for the US Marines and Navy. Corsair pilots claimed 2,040 aerial victories against 189 losses to enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 11.3 to 1. This was the lowest loss rate of any American fighter in the Pacific War. But beyond the numbers, beyond the statistics, the Corsair's true impact was psychological. It broke Japanese air power not just through superior performance, but through terror. The whistle of a diving Corsair became synonymous with death. Japanese pilots who survived the war spoke of the Corsair with a respect bordering on fear that they accorded no other Allied aircraft. Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest surviving ace, said it most clearly in post-war interviews. The Corsair was the best fighter in the Pacific, he stated flatly. Better than our Zero, better than the Army's fighters, better than anything we could develop. It was faster, tougher, more heavily armed. American pilots were well trained and disciplined. But what made it truly terrifying was that it seemed unstoppable. You could hit it, and hit it, and hit it, and it would keep coming. And when its gun spoke, you died. We learned to run when we saw those bent wings. Running was better than dying. The British Royal Navy also operated Corsairs extensively, and they saw action in European waters as well as the Pacific. British Fleet Air Arm squadrons participated in Operation Tungsten, the series of attacks on the German battleship Tirpitz in Norwegian fjords in April, July and August 1944. While the Tirpitz operations didn't involve air-to-air combat, They demonstrated the Corsair's versatility and punch as a strike aircraft. British Corsairs also operated extensively in the Pacific theatre, participating in attacks on Japanese positions in Southeast Asia and later in strikes on the Japanese mainland in the war's final months. The French also received Corsairs and used them effectively during the First Indochina War. But it was in American hands, in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese, that the Corsair earned its legendary status and its terrifying nickname. The legacy of the Corsair extended well beyond World War II. The aircraft continued in frontline service through the Korean War, where it excelled in the close air support role. Marine Corsair pilots flew thousands of sorties supporting UN ground forces, and remarkably, in September 1952, Captain Jesse Fulmar shot down a MiG-15 jet fighter while flying his Corsair, proving that even in the jet age, the old bent wing bird could still fight. Various nations continued operating Corsairs into the 1960s. The aircraft saw combat in the football war between Honduras and El Salvador in 1969, making it one of the few aircraft to participate in combat from World War II through to the jet age. Today, several dozen Corsairs remain airworthy, maintained by collectors and museums. At air shows around the world, spectators can still hear that distinctive sound, the whistle that once meant death to thousands of Japanese soldiers and pilots, the sound that earned it the name Whistling Death. For those who know the history, hearing a Corsair fly overhead is a profound experience. That sound, that unmistakable bent wing silhouette, represents one of the most effective weapons of World War II, an aircraft that helped turn the tide in the Pacific and terrorized an enemy that had once seemed invincible. Japanese veterans who encountered Corsairs in combat, the few who survived, carried memories of those encounters for the rest of their lives. In reunions between American and Japanese veterans in the decades after the war, Japanese pilots would ask American Corsair pilots about their aircraft, about their tactics, about how it felt to fly such a dominant machine. The respect was genuine, the fear undimmed even decades later. One such reunion in the 1980s brought together former enemies who had fought in the skies over the Pacific. An American Corsair pilot, now elderly, met a Japanese Zero pilot who had also survived the war. Through an interpreter, they shared stories. The Japanese pilot asked to see photographs of the American's Corsair. When shown pictures of the F4U, the ultimate variant, the Japanese veteran nodded slowly. This one, he said, we called the Blue Devil. When we saw these in 1945, we knew the war was lost. You could not fight them. You could only die against them or run. I chose to run when I could. That is why I am here today. I do not feel shame for running. The Corsair was simply too much. The American pilot asked the Japanese veteran what it was like facing Corsairs. The Japanese pilot's answer was illuminating. Terrifying, he said simply. You always knew they were faster. You knew their guns would kill you if they hit. But the worst part was the sound. That whistle. Once you heard it, you knew you had seconds to react. Usually, it was not enough time. The sound haunted my dreams for years after the war. Even now, when I hear a similar sound, my heart races. That whistle meant death was coming for you. Modern historians analysing the Pacific Air War have concluded that the Corsair's impact was strategic as well as tactical. By achieving and maintaining air superiority over the Pacific Islands, Corsairs enabled American ground forces to operate with minimal threat from Japanese air attack. This air superiority was essential to the success of the island hopping campaign that brought American forces ever closer to Japan itself. The Corsair also forced Japanese strategic decisions. The inability to achieve air superiority led directly to the adoption of kamikaze tactics in late 1944. When Japanese commanders realized they could no longer win air-to-air combat against Corsairs, Hellcats, and other American fighters, they chose to use aircraft as guided missiles, accepting certain death in exchange for the possibility of hitting American ships. This desperate tactic was an admission that conventional air combat had become hopeless. The industrial story behind the Corsair is equally important. While Japanese factories struggled to produce aircraft due to resource shortages and Allied bombing, American factories churned out Corsairs in vast numbers. The contrast in industrial capacity was stark. When an American squadron lost Corsairs in combat, replacement aircraft arrived within days or weeks. When the Japanese lost Zeros, replacement might take months, if they came at all. This industrial superiority, combined with better pilot training and superior aircraft performance, created an insurmountable advantage. One of the most telling statistics is the loss ratio in training. During 1943 and early 1944, American training bases lost hundreds of Corsairs in accidents as new pilots learned to handle the tricky fighter. These losses, tragic as they were accepted as the cost of preparing pilots for combat. By the time American pilots reached the Pacific, they had mastered the Corsair and knew how to exploit its strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. Japanese pilot training, by contrast, was declining throughout the war. Fuel shortages meant less flying time. Experienced instructors were pulled from training to combat roles and were killed. By 1945, some Japanese pilots were entering combat with minimal training, facing American pilots who were thoroughly prepared and flying superior aircraft. The outcome was predictable and tragic. The personal stories of Corsair pilots reveal the human dimension of this technological and tactical superiority. Pilots like Ken Walsh, who shot down 21 Japanese aircraft and earned the Medal of Honor. Gregory Boyington, who scored 22 victories in Corsairs and survived Japanese captivity. Ira Kepford, who achieved 17 victories and was known for his aggressive tactics. These men and thousands of others flew Corsairs in combat, and their collective achievements destroyed Japanese air power. But the story must also acknowledge the Japanese pilots who faced them. Men like Saburo Sakai, who survived impossible odds and lived to tell his story. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's top ace with over 80 claimed victories, who died not in combat but when his transport aircraft was shot down. Warrant Officer Katsuo Kato, who developed defensive tactics specifically for countering Corsairs and lived to see the war's end. These Japanese pilots were skilled, brave, and determined. They were not defeated by lack of courage or skill. They were defeated by industrial capacity, superior training systems, and an aircraft, the Corsair, that embodied all of America's advantages in one devastating package. The night fighter variant of the Corsair deserves additional emphasis. The F4U-2, though produced in tiny numbers, had a strategic impact far beyond what 34 aircraft should have been able to achieve. By denying the Japanese the ability to operate freely at night, these radar-equipped Corsairs forced changes in Japanese tactics and disrupted supply lines. The Japanese had used night cover to move supplies, conduct bombing raids, and reposition forces. Corsair night fighters made these operations much more dangerous and less effective. First Lieutenant Frank Lang, the night fighter pilot who later became a Major General, reflected on his experiences decades later. "We were doing something that had never been done before," he said. "Single-pilot night fighters with radar were a revolutionary concept. The Japanese didn't know how to counter us because they didn't understand what we were doing. We'd appear out of the darkness, shoot them down, and vanish. It must have seemed like black magic to them. The radar wasn't perfect, the cockpit workload was immense, but the Corsair was stable enough and forgiving enough to handle it, and the psychological impact on the Japanese was worth far more than our actual kill count." Another dimension of the Corsair story is its role in close air support. While the aerial combat victories garnered most of the attention, Corsair spent much of 1944 and 1945 attacking ground targets. The combination of bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire made them devastatingly effective against Japanese positions. During the Okinawa campaign, Corsairs flew thousands of close air support sorties. They attacked cave positions, destroyed artillery emplacements, and provided covering fire for advancing Marine and Army units. The Japanese defenders, unable to move during daylight due to Corsair patrols, were pinned in their positions and systematically destroyed. One Marine infantry officer, interviewed after the battle, described the impact. "The Corsairs saved countless Marine lives at Okinawa. Japanese positions that would have taken days to reduce with infantry attacks were destroyed in minutes by Corsairs. We would mark targets with smoke grenades, and the Corsairs would come in and tear those positions apart. The Japanese couldn't retreat, couldn't reinforce, couldn't operate in daylight. They were trapped and destroyed. The blue planes were guardian angels. The Corsair's effectiveness as a ground attack platform came with costs. Flying low and slow to deliver bombs and rockets exposed Corsairs to anti-aircraft fire, and losses to ground fire were significant. But the rugged construction that made Corsair survivable in air combat also helped them survive ground fire. Corsairs returned from missions with incredible battle damage, holes in wings and fuselage, damaged engines, shot away control surfaces, and still brought their pilots home. This survivability was a crucial factor in maintaining pilot morale and sustaining operations. The final months of the war saw Corsairs ranging across the Japanese home islands, attacking airfields, factories, and transportation infrastructure. By July and August 1945, with Japanese air defences minimal, Corsairs operated with near impunity. The whistle of diving Corsairs became a sound heard daily across Japan, a constant reminder of American air superiority and the hopelessness of continued resistance. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Corsair units were prepared to support the invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that would have dwarfed the Normandy invasion. The Corsairs' role would have been crucial, providing close air support, combat air patrol, and attacks on Japanese defences. The fact that the invasion never occurred, due to Japan's surrender after the atomic bombings, probably saved thousands of American lives and tens of thousands of Japanese lives. But there's no doubt that Corsairs would have dominated the skies over Japan, just as they had dominated the skies over every Pacific battlefield since 1943. The technological evolution of the Corsair during the war is noteworthy. From the initial F4U-1 with its problematic visibility and handling, through the F4U-1A with improved canopy and modified landing gear, to the F4U-1D with enhanced ground attack capability, to the ultimate F4U-4 with its 2,450 horsepower engine and 440 mph top speed, the aircraft continuously improved. Each variant addressed lessons learned from combat, incorporating pilot feedback and engineering refinements. This evolution kept the Corsair at the cutting edge of fighter technology throughout the war. By contrast, the Japanese Zero saw only incremental improvements, and later war Japanese fighters like the Kawanishi N1K and Nakajima Ki-84, while capable, were produced in insufficient numbers and flown by inadequately trained pilots to change the outcome. The Corsair's inverted gull wing, initially designed purely for engineering reasons, became one of the most recognizable aircraft silhouettes of World War II. Japanese spotters could identify Corsairs from miles away by that distinctive shape. In some ways, this worked against the aircraft. It removed the element of surprise, but in other ways, it enhanced the psychological impact. Japanese soldiers and pilots seeing those bent wings approaching knew exactly what was coming. The industrial production story deserves deeper examination. Vaught's Stratford plant in Connecticut, Goodyear's plant in Akron, Ohio, and Brewster's plant on Long Island collectively produced over 12,500 Corsairs during the war. The logistics of building these complex aircraft in such quantities was staggering. Each Corsair required thousands of individual parts, hundreds of pounds of aluminum, complex engine systems, hydraulic systems, electrical systems, and armament. American workers, many of them women who had never worked in factories before the war, built these aircraft with precision and speed that Japanese industry couldn't match. The quality control was rigorous, ensuring that Corsairs arriving at Pacific bases were ready for combat with minimal additional work. This industrial capacity was a weapon in itself, as devastating to Japanese hopes as the performance of the individual aircraft. The maintenance and logistics story is equally important to understanding the Corsair's dominance. American support units in the Pacific developed highly efficient systems for maintaining Corsairs in combat conditions. Mobile maintenance units could perform engine changes, repair battle damage, and conduct major overhauls right at forward airfields. Spare parts flowed from the United States in a steady stream. When a Corsair needed an engine replacement, the maintenance crews could have it back in the air within days. Japanese maintenance, by contrast, was hampered by parts shortages, lack of specialized tools, and insufficient numbers of trained mechanics. A Zero with engine trouble might be grounded for weeks or permanently. This meant that even when Japanese aircraft weren't being shot down, attrition through maintenance issues was steadily reducing Japanese air strength. The Americans could sustain their air operations indefinitely, while Japanese capability was constantly declining. The Corsair's armament system was another area where American engineering superiority showed. The 6 Browning M2 machine guns were among the most reliable weapons ever developed. They could fire thousands of rounds with minimal stoppages, they were relatively easy to maintain, and their ammunition was standardized across multiple aircraft types. The .50 caliber round itself was a masterpiece of ammunition design, combining armor penetration, incendiary effect, and destructive power in a package that was manageable in terms of weight and recoil. Japanese aircraft carried a mix of 7.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannons. The cannons had more explosive power per hit, but they carried less ammunition, had lower rates of fire, and were prone to jamming. Japanese pilots often complained about their weapons' reliability. In combat, the Corsair pilot could fire longer bursts, confident his guns would work, while Japanese pilots had to carefully manage their limited cannon ammunition and hope their guns didn't jam at the critical moment. The training differential between American and Japanese pilots became more pronounced as the war progressed. By 1944, American pilots arriving in the Pacific had typically completed 400 to 600 hours of flight training. This included extensive time in the Corsair itself, gunnery practice against towed targets, formation flying, instrument training for flying in clouds and at night, and tactical training in simulated combat scenarios. They arrived at their squadrons with solid skills and were then further trained by experienced combat pilots before being sent on their first missions. Japanese pilot training in 1944 and 1945 was a shadow of what it had been in 1941. Fuel shortages meant pilots received as little as 100 hours of total flight time before being sent to combat units. Gunnery training was minimal. Many pilots never fired at a towed target. Tactical training was theoretical rather than practical. When these inadequately prepared pilots encountered American pilots flying Corsairs, the outcome was predictable. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. The psychological warfare aspect of the Corsair's distinctive whistle was something American commanders recognized and subtly encouraged. Pilots were taught to maximize their speed in dives, which increased the volume and pitch of the whistle. Ground attack missions often began with steep dives even when more shallow approaches would have been tactically adequate, specifically because the whistle terrified Japanese ground forces. This was psychological warfare at its most effective, using the aircraft itself as an instrument of terror. Japanese soldiers who survived Corsair attacks described the psychological toll, the constant stress of knowing that at any moment the whistle might begin, signaling incoming death, wore down morale and combat effectiveness. Japanese troops became reluctant to move during daylight hours. Supply convoys would only travel at night. Artillery positions would fire a few rounds and then immediately relocate, fearing Corsair retaliation. This disruption of normal military operations was as valuable as the physical destruction the Corsairs inflicted. One particularly effective Corsair tactic was the cab rank system developed during the Okinawa campaign. Corsairs would orbit over the battlefield in a stacked formation, like taxis waiting at a cab stand. Ground controllers could call them in to attack specific targets within minutes. Japanese forces found it impossible to concentrate for counterattacks, because Corsairs would strike any observed concentration immediately. This responsive, flexible use of air power was revolutionary, and gave American ground forces an enormous advantage. The Corsair pilots themselves were a diverse group, reflecting America's mobilization of its population for war. They came from farms and cities, from wealthy families and working-class backgrounds. What united them was rigorous selection and training. The washout rate for fighter pilot training was high. Only the most skilled and determined made it through. By the time they reached the Pacific flying Corsairs, they were among the most elite warriors America had produced. The aces, pilots who shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft, were the tip of the spear. But the average Corsair pilot, even those who never became aces, were highly competent and dangerous opponents. The Japanese couldn't afford to only worry about the few aces. Every Corsair they encountered was flown by a well-trained pilot who understood his aircraft and knew how to use it effectively. This depth of quality across the entire pilot force was something Japan couldn't match. The communication and coordination systems supporting Corsair operations were also superior. American forces had excellent radio equipment, allowing real-time coordination between fighters, ground controllers, and strike aircraft. Radar gave early warning of Japanese air attacks and helped direct Corsair patrols to intercept. This integrated air defense system meant that Japanese aircraft were often detected and intercepted long before they reached their targets. Japanese communications were less sophisticated, radios were less reliable, and coordination between units was more difficult. Japanese pilots often flew missions with minimal support, no early warning of American fighters, and limited ability to call for help if they encountered trouble. This put them at a systematic disadvantage that compounded their aircraft and training deficits. The weather in the Pacific presented challenges for all pilots, but the Corsair's rugged construction and the superior instrument training American pilots received made them more capable of operating in poor conditions. Corsairs flew missions in weather that grounded Japanese aircraft. This meant that American forces could maintain operational tempo even when conditions were marginal, while Japanese forces were constrained to operating only in good weather. The combat reports from Corsair pilots reveal the brutal effectiveness of their tactics. A typical report might read, "Sighted 4 Zeros at 15,000 feet. We were at 22,000. Dove on them from astern and above. I fired a burst into the trailing Zero from 300 yards. Observed hits on fuselage and wing route. Enemy aircraft caught fire and went down spinning. Did not see pilot bail out. Climbed back to altitude without any return fire from remaining Zeros." This matter-of-fact description of killing another human being was the reality of air combat. From the Japanese perspective, that same combat might be recorded. Patrolling at 15,000 feet when we were attacked by Corsairs from above. They dove so fast we had no time to react. Warrant Officer Tanaka's aircraft exploded. The rest of us tried to evade, but the Corsairs climbed away before we could engage. We could not catch them. Tanaka is dead. We could do nothing. The frustration and helplessness in such accounts is palpable. The night-fighting Corsairs deserve additional attention for their innovative use of technology. The airborne intercept radar systems were cutting-edge for 1943, and mounting them in a single-seat fighter was an ambitious undertaking. The radar display was crude by modern standards, just a small oscilloscope screen showing blips for targets. But in the hands of skilled pilots, it was enough. The night fighter pilots developed remarkable skills. They had to interpret the radar display while flying on instruments in total darkness, navigate to the target area, acquire the target visually, maneuver for an attack position, and fire accurately, all while maintaining situational awareness and avoiding disorientation. It required a special kind of pilot, and the men selected for night fighter duty were among the best. The F4U night fighters scored their victories individually, 1 or 2 aircraft at a time, but their cumulative impact was significant. By the end of 1944, Japanese forces in the Central Pacific had largely abandoned night air operations in areas where American night fighters operated. The risk was too great, the losses too high. This gave American forces uncontested use of the night, which they exploited for supply movements, troop repositioning, and rest without fear of air attack. The Corsairs' role in supporting amphibious assaults was crucial. At Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Corsairs provided cover for the invasion fleets and close air support for the troops ashore. They flew multiple sorties per day, attacking Japanese positions just ahead of advancing American infantry. The coordination between air and ground forces became increasingly sophisticated, with forward air controllers on the ground directing Corsair strikes against targets sometimes only a few hundred yards from friendly forces. This close air support came with risks. Several incidents of friendly fire occurred when Corsairs attacked American positions by mistake. But procedures improved, and by 1945 the close air support system was highly effective and relatively safe. The use of coloured smoke to mark targets, direct radio communication between ground forces and pilots, and careful briefings before missions all contributed to minimising friendly fire incidents while maximising effectiveness against enemy positions. The Corsairs' contribution to the submarine rescue efforts is less known but significant. When American submarine crews were forced to bail out over water, Corsairs would circle overhead, marking their position and protecting them from Japanese forces until rescue could arrive. Many submarine pilots owed their lives to Corsair pilots who stayed on station, sometimes for hours, directing rescue aircraft and boats to downed airmen. The Air-Sea Rescue Service in the Pacific was remarkably effective, and Corsairs played a key role. The knowledge that if they were shot down over water, Corsairs would protect them until rescue arrived, gave American pilots confidence and boosted morale. Japanese pilots had no such assurance. If they went down over water, rescue was unlikely. This difference affected pilot aggressiveness and willingness to press attacks. The Corsairs' performance at high altitude was particularly important in the later stages of the war. Japanese bombers attempting to attack American positions often flew at high altitudes to avoid interception. The Corsair's turbocharged engine maintained power at altitudes where Japanese engines lost performance. This meant Corsairs could intercept high-altitude raids that other American fighters struggled to reach. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, the performance gap between Corsairs and Japanese aircraft widened even further. The Corsair could still climb, accelerate and maneuver effectively, while Japanese aircraft were struggling. This high-altitude capability made Corsairs particularly valuable for fleet defense, where they could intercept incoming raids at maximum range and altitude. The kamikaze threat in late 1944 and 1945 forced changes in Corsair tactics. Instead of seeking dogfights, Corsairs on combat air patrol over the fleet focused on intercepting suicide aircraft before they could reach the ships. This required perfect coordination, with multiple layers of Corsairs at different altitudes creating a defensive barrier. The kamikaze pilots, already facing certain death, still had to penetrate this barrier to reach their targets. The statistics from Okinawa show the effectiveness of this defense. Corsairs and other American fighters shot down hundreds of kamikaze aircraft before they reached the fleet. Many more were damaged and forced to crash short of their targets. While some kamikazes got through and caused significant damage, the losses would have been much worse without the Corsair patrols. The psychological profile of Corsair pilots is interesting. These were young men, most in their early 20s, given incredible responsibility and power. They flew machines capable of speeds over 400 miles per hour, carried enough firepower to destroy multiple enemy aircraft, and made life and death decisions in split seconds. The training and selection process identified men who could handle this responsibility without being overwhelmed by it. Many Corsair pilots later described the experience as simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. The fear before a mission, the adrenaline during combat, the relief at returning safely, the grief when squadron mates didn't return, these emotional extremes were part of the daily reality. The bonds formed between pilots in combat squadrons were intense and lasted lifetimes. Decades after the war, Corsair pilots would reunite, share stories, and remember fallen comrades. The maintenance crews who kept the Corsairs flying deserve immense credit. These enlisted men worked in brutal tropical conditions, often in the open air with minimal equipment, performing complex maintenance and repairs. They changed engines, patched bullet holes, repaired hydraulic systems, and conducted countless other tasks to keep the aircraft operational. The maintenance crews took pride in their aircraft and pilots, and the relationship between pilots and crew chiefs was often close and mutually respectful. A crew chief's job was demanding. Each Corsair required daily inspections, regular maintenance, and constant attention. When an aircraft returned from a mission with battle damage, the crew chief and his team would work through the night if necessary to get it back into service. The availability rate of Corsairs, the percentage of aircraft ready for combat at any given time, was remarkably high, testament to the skill and dedication of the maintenance crews. The evolution of Corsair tactics throughout the war shows the learning process of military innovation. Early tactics were adaptations of peacetime doctrine, which proved inadequate against Japanese opponents. The Valentine's Day Massacre was a harsh lesson. But Marine and Navy pilots learned quickly, adapting their tactics to exploit the Corsair's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. By mid-1943, the tactical doctrine was well established. Maintain altitude advantage, attack from above with speed, never try to turn with zeros, use the zoom climb to regain altitude after an attack. These tactics became standard and were taught to new pilots arriving in theatre. The fact that these tactics worked consistently across different units and different pilots shows they were sound principles based on the aircraft's capabilities. The Japanese tried to develop counter-tactics, but their options were limited. They couldn't match the Corsair's speed, so they couldn't escape. They couldn't match its climb rate, so they couldn't regain altitude advantage once lost. Their only advantage was maneuverability, but American pilots learned not to engage in turning fights. Some Japanese pilots tried diving away from Corsair attacks, but Corsairs were faster in dives too. Desperate Japanese tactics in 1945 included ramming attacks, where pilots would deliberately crash into American aircraft. This kamikaze in the air was as desperate as the kamikaze attacks on ships, and it was rarely effective. Corsairs were agile enough to avoid ramming attempts, and even when Japanese pilots succeeded in hitting a Corsair, the rugged construction often allowed the American aircraft to survive the collision, while the lighter Japanese aircraft disintegrated. The technological arms race in aircraft development favoured the United States. While Japan was struggling to develop new fighters that could compete with the Corsair, the United States was already working on jet aircraft. The F4U, the ultimate piston engine variant of the Corsair, represented the peak of propeller-driven fighter development. It incorporated every lesson learned from 3 years of Pacific combat. The F4U-4's performance was extraordinary. Maximum speed of 446 miles per hour at 26,200 feet, rate of climb of 3,170 feet per minute, service ceiling of 40,500 feet, range of 15 miles. These specifications exceeded most Japanese aircraft in every category. The F4U-4 could outrun, outclimb, outdive, and outfight anything Japan had. But even as the F4U-4 was entering service, American designers were working on its successor. The F4U-5, which would enter service after the war, featured even more improvements. And beyond that, jet aircraft were in development that would make even the mighty Corsair obsolete. This relentless technological progress was something Japan couldn't match. The Corsair's success influenced post-war fighter design. The inverted gull-wing configuration was not widely copied. It was specific to the Corsair's design requirements, but other features became standard. The emphasis on speed and firepower over maneuverability became doctrine. The importance of pilot visibility, rugged construction, and high-altitude performance were lessons incorporated into future designs. The Korean War gave the Corsair a second combat career. The F4U-4 and F4U-5 variants saw extensive service in Korea, primarily in the close air support role. Against North Korean and Chinese ground forces, Corsairs were devastatingly effective. They carried heavier loads than in World War II, including napalm, and their accuracy in delivering ordnance was excellent. The fact that Captain Jesse Fulmer shot down a MiG-15 jet fighter in 1952 while flying a Corsair is remarkable. The MiG-15 was one of the most advanced fighters of its era, capable of speeds over 600 miles per hour. The kill was achieved through exceptional flying skill and perfect positioning, but it demonstrated that even a decade after its design, the Corsair was still dangerous in the right hands. The Corsair's longevity is testament to its fundamental soundness as a design. From its first flight in 1940 to its final combat missions in the late 1960s, nearly 3 decades of service, the Corsair proved adaptable and effective. Few aircraft in history have served as long or as successfully. The preservation of Corsairs in museums and private collections allows new generations to appreciate this historic aircraft. The Commemorative Air Force, the Military Aviation Museum and other organisations maintain airworthy Corsairs that perform at air shows. Seeing a Corsair fly, hearing that distinctive engine and whistle, connects modern audiences to the history these aircraft represent. For historians studying the Pacific War, the Corsair represents a turning point. Its introduction in early 1943 marked the beginning of the end for Japanese air power. The statistical dominance Corsairs achieved, the 11-to-1 kill ratio, the thousands of ground attack sorties, the psychological impact, all contributed to American victory. It's impossible to imagine the Pacific War without the Corsair. The human cost of the air war must be remembered. Every victory represented a Japanese pilot killed, a young man who would never return home. Every loss was an American pilot, equally young, equally valued by family and friends. The efficiency of the Corsair as a killing machine shouldn't obscure the tragedy of war itself. The aircraft was a tool, wielded by men in a conflict neither side could avoid. Japanese veterans' reflections on facing Corsairs provide valuable perspective. Their accounts, honest about fear and defeat, help complete the historical record. The respect they expressed for the Corsair and its pilots was genuine. In post-war years, when former enemies could meet as friends, these conversations revealed common humanity beneath the wartime animosity. One particularly poignant account comes from a Japanese mechanic who serviced Zeros. He described watching Corsairs attack his airfield. We would hear the whistle and run for shelter. The Corsairs would strafe the runway, destroying our aircraft. We would work all night to repair the damage, only to have them return the next day. It was hopeless. We knew we were losing, but we kept working because it was our duty. When the war ended, I felt relief more than anything. The Corsairs would stop coming. We could stop running from that terrible sound. The strategic implications of air superiority cannot be overstated. Because Corsairs and other American fighters controlled the skies, Japanese ground forces couldn't maneuver freely, couldn't supply their troops adequately, couldn't coordinate operations effectively. This air superiority enabled American amphibious assaults that would have been impossible if Japanese aircraft controlled the skies. Imagine the Iwo Jima invasion without air superiority. Japanese aircraft would have attacked the invasion fleet, the landing beaches, the supply ships. The Marines would have faced not just ground fire but constant air attack. casualties would have been catastrophically higher. The battle might have been lost entirely. But because Corsairs and other American fighters controlled the air, the invasion succeeded despite fierce Japanese ground resistance. This pattern repeated at every Pacific battlefield. Air superiority, achieved and maintained by Corsairs and other American fighters, was the prerequisite for amphibious assault and ground advance. The Corsair wasn't just a fighter aircraft, it was a key enabler of American strategy in the Pacific. The Corsair's design influenced civilian aviation as well. After the war, some Corsairs were converted for civilian use, including air racing. The Unlimited class of air racing featured modified Corsairs that achieved remarkable speeds. The Cook-Cleland Corsair, highly modified for racing, won the Thompson Trophy race in 1947 at an average speed of 396 miles per hour. This demonstrated that the basic Corsair design had potential beyond its military role. The photographic record of Corsairs in combat is extensive. Navy and Marine combat photographers documented Corsair operations throughout the war. These images, showing Corsairs on carrier decks, at island airfields, in flight, and in combat, provide visual testimony to the aircraft's role. The photographs also show the pilots, young faces beneath flight helmets, revealing the human dimension of air combat. Gun camera footage from Corsairs provides dramatic evidence of their effectiveness. These films, shot through cameras synchronized with the machine guns, show Corsairs attacking Japanese aircraft. The footage is stark, showing the devastating effect of 6 .50 caliber machine guns converging on a target. Japanese aircraft caught in these bursts simply come apart. Wings separating, fuselages breaking, aircraft falling from the sky trailing smoke and flame. The Corsair's contribution to naval aviation doctrine was significant. The aircraft proved that single-seat fighters could operate effectively from carriers, that radar could be used in single-seat night fighters, and that fighter bombers could perform both air superiority and ground attack roles effectively. These lessons influenced post-war carrier aviation and remain relevant today. The economics of the Corsair program were favourable. The unit cost of an F4U-1 in 1943 was approximately $50,000, equivalent to about $800,000 in 2025 dollars. For that price, the Navy and Marines got an aircraft that could outperform Japanese fighters costing similar amounts, while carrying more weapons and requiring less maintenance. The return on investment measured in combat effectiveness was excellent. The Corsair's safety record, after the initial training accidents, was relatively good for World War II standards. The aircraft's rugged construction meant pilots survived crashes that would have been fatal in lighter aircraft. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires in many cases where Japanese aircraft would have burned. The armour protection saved lives. These features, which added weight and cost, were worthwhile investments in pilot survival. The Corsair community, veterans who flew and maintained them, remained active for decades after the war. Squadron reunions brought together men who had shared the intense experience of combat. They mourned those who didn't return and celebrated their own survival. These reunions kept alive the history and traditions of Corsair squadrons, ensuring that younger generations would know the story. The technical manual for the Corsair ran to hundreds of pages, detailing every system and procedure. Pilots had to master this information, understanding how the engine worked, how the hydraulic systems operated, what to do if systems failed. This technical knowledge, combined with flying skill and tactical training, made Corsair pilots effective. The complexity of the aircraft required intelligent, educated pilots who could think through problems under stress. The Corsair's influence on popular culture has been significant. The aircraft appeared in numerous films about World War II and the Pacific War. Television series like Bar Bar Black Sheep dramatized the exploits of Gregory Boyington and VMF 214. These fictional accounts, while sometimes taking liberties with historical accuracy, introduced the Corsair to audiences who had no direct connection to the war. Model aircraft companies have produced Corsair kits in every scale, from tiny plastic models to large radio-controlled replicas. Enthusiasts build these models with great attention to detail, researching specific aircraft and their markings. This hobby keeps a live interest in the Corsair and its history. Video games featuring World War II air combat invariably include the Corsair as a player aircraft. Flight simulators allow modern enthusiasts to experience virtually what it was like to fly a Corsair in combat. While no simulation can truly capture the reality of combat, These games introduce new audiences to the aircraft and its capabilities. The Corsair's story is ultimately about more than just an aircraft. It's about industrial capacity, technological innovation, training systems, tactical doctrine, and the courage of men in combat. The aircraft was the physical embodiment of American advantages in all these areas. When a Japanese pilot saw those bent wings approaching and heard that terrible whistle, he was facing not just one aircraft, but the full weight of American military and industrial power. The lessons of the Corsair remain relevant. Superior technology matters, training matters, industrial capacity matters, tactical innovation matters. But perhaps most importantly, the integration of all these factors matters. The Corsair wasn't successful because of any single factor. It was successful because American military planners integrated superior aircraft, excellent training, sound tactics, robust logistics, and overwhelming industrial production into a coherent system. Modern military aviation still follows principles established during the Corsair era. Air superiority enables ground operations. Well-trained pilots are force multipliers. Rugged, reliable aircraft are more valuable than fragile, high-performance machines that can't survive combat damage. These lessons, learned in the Pacific skies of 1943-1945, remain valid today. The Corsair's legacy is secure. Among the great fighter aircraft of World War II, the Spitfire, Mustang, Lightning, Hellcat, Thunderbolt, and others, the Corsair holds a place of honor. Its combat record speaks for itself. The respect it earned from enemies and the fear it inspired testify to its effectiveness. The nickname Whistling Death, given by those who faced it, is perhaps the highest compliment any weapon of war can receive. Acknowledgement from one's enemies that they have encountered something truly formidable. For the men who flew Corsairs in combat, the aircraft was more than a machine. It was their protection, their weapon, their means of survival. They trusted their lives to it daily, and it generally brought them home. The bond between pilot and aircraft was personal and deep. Many Corsair pilots, decades after the war, would become emotional discussing their aircraft, remembering specific missions, specific fights, friends lost, and moments of terror and triumph. The Japanese pilots and soldiers who survived encounters with Corsairs carried different memories. Memories of fear, of helplessness, of watching comrades die, of that distinctive whistle that signaled incoming death. Their testimony, given freely in post-war years, provides the other side of the story, the perspective of those who faced the Corsair and lived to tell about it. In the end, the Corsair was a weapon of war, designed to kill and destroy. It fulfilled that purpose with devastating effectiveness. But it was also a technological achievement, a testament to human ingenuity and engineering excellence. The men who designed it, built it, maintained it, and flew it contributed to victory in the Pacific and helped bring World War II to an end. That contribution, purchased with the lives of young men on both sides, should be remembered and honoured. The story of the Corsair, from its problematic debut to its domination of Pacific skies, from Whistling Death to Angels of Okinawa, is a story of war and technology, of courage and fear, of victory and defeat. It deserves to be told and retold, remembered and studied, so that future generations understand what happened in those Pacific skies 8 decades ago, when bent-wing fighters whistled death from above and helped determine the fate of nations.